As the invasion of Iraq began, and with the common enemy, Saddam Hussein no more, the Iranians and the Saudis began drifting apart again. Both countries opposed the Iraq war, yet both were at odds on what should come after Saddam. There was now a new vacuum in the region, waiting to be filled. Hello everyone, I'm your host Ibrahim Al-Khamis, and welcome back to the final episode of our three-part series on the modern history of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran continued to have grievances against the Saudis, as they backed sanctions towards the Iranian oil industry and held fear towards Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program. It was clear the Saudis and the Iranians were beginning to drift apart once again, as new opportunities in the region began to emerge. Questions on the ever-rising influence of Hezbollah in Lebanon and the strengthening of the IRGC's network of proxies in Iraq and the region alarmed the Saudis, while the Iranians feared the Saudis' close relationship with the USA undermined its ambition, and the mounting pressure from the West towards its nuclear program was beginning to generate tension across the region. And with the Iraq war, the Saudis were cautiously monitoring the return of previously exiled Shia Islamist organizations and individuals from Tehran and the West. Previously exiled during Saddam's reign, many Islamists began setting up shop and gaining political clout. Many simply thankful for Iranian support during the Iran-Iraq war, while some were inspired by the Iranian model of Wilayat al-Faqih. The Iranian-backed groups began to establish ever-growing influence on Iraqi politics. Faced with growing pressure back home to withdraw from the costly war in Iraq, the Obama administration began pulling out its soldiers from the war from 2009 to 2011. The withdrawal of American troops was seen by the GCC as a premature move. Iraq seemed to have a weak and largely uncooperative central government, with militias and parties practically ruling parts of the country in their own names. During the invasion by the US, many of the old regime's army were disbanded, and some Ba'ath army officials put on wanted lists by the new emerging Shiite militias and the government. Iraq was rife with assassinations and kidnappings that undermined its political process. Iranian influence grew as Iranian Shia Islamist parties began winning elections in Shia-dominated areas, gaining power through various political parties formed by the militias. Sectarian struggle continued, as it was during the beginning of the war, fueled by Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Shia Islamist groups vying for control of the country. Meanwhile, amidst this, Saudi and Iranian public rhetoric escalated higher than usual, taking a larger religious tone in the late 2000s and early 2010s, echoing back to the days of Khomeini. And again the media war began to flare up between the countries. Shia groups backed by Iran consistently propagated the idea that Al-Qaeda and later ISIS was funded and backed by Saudi Arabia to cripple their growing power. The Iranians once again promoted the idea that Saudi and their version of Islam, Wahhabism as they called it, were to blame for Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all extremism within Sunni Islam, while some Saudi sheikhs in the kingdom began to publicly attack Shias, referring to Shias commonly as Rawafid, a term meaning rejectionist, historically used to excommunicate Shias from Islam, as they reject the first three caliphs of the Rashidun. And to salt wounds further, some clerics commenting on political issues in Saudi began to hint at a larger conspiracy, that all Shias were all automatically loyal to Iran, referring to Iranians as Majus, an Arabic term for Zoroastrian, Iran's main religion before Islam. The growing political tensions grew even larger when in 2011 the US reported its discovery and prevention of a plot backed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to assassinate Adil al-Jubair, then Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the USA, in a bomb plot planned in Washington. The IRGC were directly implicated by the CIA. And as the Arab Spring protests began to take hold in Syria, tension spread from Syria to Iraq, with civil war on the ground. Al-Qaeda in Iraq now defected from Al-Qaeda's leadership and rebranded themselves as Islamic State in Iraq and Sham. ISIS began to rise and spread around Iraq and Syria. ISIS was formidable, highly trained, and extremely tactical, with their military victories exposing the American-trained Iraqi army's incompetence and Iraq's slow, disunited, and tense political reaction. ISIS began moving around Iraq, scoring victories with relative ease, seizing towns and cities. As a response, Ayatollah Sistani, a highly influential Shia Iraqi cleric, issued a religious fatwa, uniting a large group of militias backed by religious fervor, forming the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, with American coalition air and Iranian ground support. The PMF began turning the tide, scoring victories against ISIS and cementing their reputation as a competent force. ISIS began losing vast ground, bombarded and fighting from all sides. The so-called Khilafah was over. The PMF continued to grow vast and strong, politically and militarily, controlling checkpoints and supplies around Iraq. As ISIS ground control ended, the PMF victorious, they began to look elsewhere to vent their resistance mantra. No longer were they resisting ISIS anymore. They were now resisting Western imperialism that manifests itself in Israel and Saudi Arabia. Far from the Iraqi border, to the south of Saudi, the Houthis, a Zaydi Shia group self-styled themselves as Ansarullah, began to gain power in Yemen. The Houthis, basing themselves in the northern Yemeni mountains at the border with Saudi, established themselves locally in the mid-2000s, furthering control during the Yemeni Revolution, and finally managing to take control of the capital Sana'a in 2014, igniting a civil war. The Houthis had been suspected of being funded by Iran. The Saudis saw the Houthis as nothing past an Iranian proxy, much like the PMF or Hezbollah. Denied by the Houthis and Iran, the Saudi and the Yemeni government both claimed Iran was involved in sponsoring the rise of the Houthis and establishing arms flow in the group managed by the IRGC. As King Abdullah's reign came to an end with his death, and King Salman ascended to the throne, the Saudis now felt surrounded by Iran's influence to the north and the south. They led an Arab coalition backed by Western powers to intervene in Yemen, seeking to restore the UN-recognized government led by the Yemeni president Mansour Hadi. Meanwhile, in contrast, the tensions were beginning to cool down between the USA and Iran, with the conclusion of the JCPOA under President Barack Obama. Celebrated in the West as a victory of diplomacy, it was seen as nothing but appeasement amongst US allies in the Middle East. It was another blow to Saudi's pro-containment policy of Iran. Although nuclear negotiations were welcomed, the Saudis were not happy that the agreement did not include checks on Iranian proxies or the Iranian missile program. Instead, as argued by both the Israelis and the GCC, the deal empowered Iran with cash and a bigger budget to continue its policy. Unfreezing Iranian assets were to be conditioned with Iranian cooperation with its neighbors. And later in 2016, popular Saudi Shia sheikh who called for the overthrow of the Saudi government during the Arab Spring, Nimr al-Nimr, a soft supporter of the Wilayat al-Faqih in Saudi Arabia, was executed. His execution was part of a mass execution of militants linked to Al-Qaeda and other organizations perceived as insurgents. The execution enraged Iran and the wider Shia world. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini argued that he was nothing but a peaceful demonstrator who voiced his opinion, not linked to Iran or any organization. He was now a martyr, while the Saudis continued their position that al-Nimr was nothing but an Iranian agent, inciting rebellion and secession. As the execution continued to cause uproar amongst the religiously aligned Iranian groups across the Middle East, protests erupted in Iran, Lebanon, and Iraq. The Saudi embassy in Tehran was stormed by protesters. Molotov cocktails were thrown and chants of death to Al Saud were heard all around. Although the Iranian government denied inciting the protests and pointing to its arrest of protesters, the Saudis took this as an excuse, nothing but diplomatic talk, arguing that no demonstration is allowed to become violent in Tehran without the government's blessing, referring to the previous 1987 ransacking of the Saudi embassy that killed a Saudi diplomat. The Saudis pulled all their diplomatic staff and cut relations with Iran, a final blow to hopes of a direct reconciliation between the two countries. And yet, with the burning and rising tensions, the Saudis gained some relief as newly elected US President Donald Trump withdrew from the Iran deal. He reimposed heavy sanctions on Tehran. Trump's policies and rhetoric was welcomed by Saudi Arabia and its close allies Bahrain and the UAE. In midst of the rising tensions in the same year, in 2008, a terrorist attack during a military parade in the city of Ahwaz, Khuzestan, shocked Iran. The attack killed 30 people, targeting both IRGC soldiers and civilians watching the parade. Both ISIS and the Saudi-backed Arab Struggle Movement for the Liberation of Ahwaz, ASMLA, claimed responsibility, with ASMLA a day later denying involvement, clarifying that responsibility was claimed by an expelled group from the organization. The Iranians quickly blamed the USA, Saudi, and the UAE for the attacks, claiming it was planned and financed by the West and the Gulf. All countries denied involvement, while Iranian news agencies began publishing a video threatening retaliation on Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. Both nations continued to defy each other publicly, leading to the 2019 Bgeg drone rocket attacks on Saudi oil facilities. The Houthis claimed responsibility, while the Americans and the UN reported it was evident the attack had Iran's fingerprints either directly or indirectly through its proxies in Iraq. A few months later, in 2020, Responding to Iranian-backed proxies' attacks on the US Embassy in Iraq, the Americans assassinated Qasem Soleimani, leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and often quoted the king and architect of Iran's proxy network, enraging Iran, which have never had a direct attack on its officials from the US before. The Iranians threatened a response to not just the US, but its allies in the region. And in mid-2020, Tehran grew more anxious as Abu Dhabi and Manama, both close allies of Riyadh, normalized relations with Tel Aviv. This move paved the way for direct and public cooperation by Israel and some Gulf states when engaging with Iran. Iran expects the Saudis to normalize themselves, or coordinate with Israelis through their Arab allies. Normalization now required the Iranians to look for an intertwining of strategy when dealing with the Gulf and Israel, rather than treating them as separate cases. This was evident as seen in the response when IRGC Brigadier General and senior official of Iran's nuclear program, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was assassinated in Tehran. Israel was widely suspected as the culprit behind the attack. Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif pointed the fingers at Israel, while also including Saudi Arabia in the conspiracy, claiming it was planned by both states together. The numerous assassinations of IRGC officials unsettled the Iranians. With no real show of force to reply without risking extreme repercussions, the Iranians now seem to be on the defensive. And now, as Trump's presidency comes to an end and former Vice President Joe Biden assumes the presidency, we are yet to unravel how US policy in the Middle East will impact issues and how Biden will navigate them. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia have had a history of cooperation and competition, less defined by their religious or ethnic nature as commonly declared, but by the constant vacuum of power that emerges around the Middle East that pits the two influential nations against each other. What certainly is true is that both countries have different visions on where the Middle East should go. As the two countries continue pushing each other for power and control, tensions continue to rise, and it is yet to see what these confrontations would lead to. I hope you enjoyed the last episode of the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brought to you by the Thursday Report. And if you'd like to show support for future episodes like these, leave a like, comment, and please subscribe. Hope to see you all again soon.